kind of start the sort of normal Prismatic program again. As you know, Rod has been writing a few things that he's been sending to Dave, has been sending around to try to keep the whole spirit of Prismatic going.
That's right.
And this first, this presentation is going to be one of the ones that Rod has put together, and I think Dave's already circulated it right to the membership. But it's about pandemics in general, and I think Rod also invited Greg Auner, who I believe is here, to help participate in this discussion, because Greg gave a talk a few years ago on epidemics and pandemics and plagues over the centuries. So this is, as we all know, we're living in, and it's not a cliche, we are living in historic times. I mean, the country and the world are not going to be the same after this, and we don't have no idea how we're getting out of it. And it's, everyone is just operating on a day-to-day basis and doing the best we can. And I've told my kids they should be writing down their thoughts, because it's something they will be relating to their kids and grandchildren when they get older. So it's altogether kind of fitting and apt that Rod give a talk about pandemics, epidemics through the ages, and I volunteered to chime in with anything about polio, because I gave a talk about polio. And I also looked up a few things about the 1918 pandemic and read a couple of books on it. So I've got I contributed a few things to Rod's talk. But anytime, Rod, you want to kind of ask any questions about polio or 1918 that I might be able to, unlikely, but might be able to help with, or ask Greg to contribute to the discussion, I think that would be really interesting as well. So Rod is going to talk about, I guess, was there a title, or is it just pandemics through the ages?
Well, the title, if I'm here, I guess I am, is Epidemics in Prismatic Times.
Rod, if I could just interrupt you just for a moment for some administrative stuff. I'm going to mute everybody. And if you want to speak, you simply unmute yourself, but that will keep the background noise out. And I am recording this, and we will put this up on YouTube sometime next week. Thank you.
Okay. Now you better tell me where unmute is.
Lower left corner.
Lower left corner.
There we go. Okay, I think I'm still on. Okay, well, as a quickie write-up that I did and sent off to Dave, thinking he might attach it to one of his flashes, and not imagining it would grow into this sort of thing. But with the help of a few others, maybe we can make a little bit of a presentation out of it with Bill and Greg and people that know a little more about this subject than I do. I just sort of did a summary. Well, there's a topic I want to touch real quickly and then get off it. Thursday's news mentioned protesters up in Lansing, some of them armed. That kind of thing is going on all over the place. Seems they disbelieve some of the coronavirus mantra that's going around, and they object to the lockdown, being thrown out of work, helicopters checking up on citizens like they're doing in Florida, drones in other cities checking up on us. In Michigan, state police turning people around on I-75. So I did a little snooping. And yes. Can you guys see me? Am I on?
You're on.
Okay, this is the CDC's guidelines on reporting coronavirus deaths. Yes, it encourages maximizing them, as does a bunch of other stuff I've looked into. Doctors who share these opinions have been censored and removed from YouTube and so on and so forth. I think this is more scary than the virus. Nobody's denying there's a serious crisis, but well, I'm afraid I'm with the protesters. But that whole contentious conversation isn't the one I intended tonight. Certainly not for this convivial company. So I'm done with it. That's all I have to say about that. Let's go on to what the talk's about. And let's turn into some better words. from an eloquent gentleman that were sent up to us. Dave, do you have the material that was sent to us? Dave, unmute yourself.
Are you going to start?
Yeah, I'm going to start it as you speak because I got to do a couple clicks.
This is a note I got yesterday from Alan Ross, who's a dedicated member, and we haven't really heard from in a while. And he sent this to me, and it just seemed perfect to be able to read this. It's a commentary by Barry Evans, who's a writer for the Villagers News in Florida. And it's an interesting conversation. I'll read it because it's too small to see on the screen. For a small amount of perspective at this moment, imagine you were born in 1900. Many would think that it was a pretty simple time of life. Then on your 14th birthday, World War I starts and ends on your 18th birthday. 22 million people perish in that war, including many of your friends who volunteered to defend freedom in Europe. Later in the year, a Spanish flu epidemic hits the planet and runs until your 20th birthday. 50 million people die from it in those 2 years. Yes, 50 million. On your 29th birthday, the Great Depression begins. Unemployment hits 25%. The world GDP drops 27%. That runs until you are 33. The country nearly collapses along with the world economy. If you were lucky, you had a job that paid $300 a year, $1 a day. When you turn 39, World War II starts. You aren't even over the hill yet, and don't try to catch your breath. If you lived in London, England, or most of continental Europe, bombing of your neighborhood or invasion of your country by foreign soldiers, along with their tank and artillery, was a daily event. Thousands of Canadian young men joined the army to defend liberty with their lives. Between your 39th and 45th birthday, 75 million people perish in that war. At 50, the Korean War starts. 5 million perish. At 55, the Vietnam War begins and doesn't end for 20 years. 4 million people perish in that conflict. On your 62nd birthday, there is the Cuban Missile Crisis, a tipping point in the Cold War. Life on our planet as we know it could have ended. Sensible leaders prevented that from happening. Now in 2020, we have the COVID-19 pandemic. Thousands have died. It feels pretty dangerous, and it is. Now think of everyone on the planet born in 1900. How do you survive all of that? Perspective is an amazing art, refined as time goes on and very enlightening. So let's try and keep things in perspective. Let's be smart. We are all in this together. Let's help each other out, and we will get through all of this. Thank you very much to Alan Ross.
Thank you, Dave. Now, is my PowerPoint up for you guys to see?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well then, Bill, Greg, those of you with some expertise, when I go off the track here, if I will.
Hang on, Rod. David's screen is still up. David, you need to release your screen so Rod can take it.
I don't have screen sharing up.
Well, we're looking at your screen.
Now it says we are viewing Rod's screen on. That's what I see.
How many people see my PowerPoint?
I can't see it.
No, I am seeing Barry Evans.
Yep, that's your. You should be able to move your PowerPoint to the next slide.
Oh, that's even though you just read that, that's in
There we go.
his
Okay.
PowerPoint. Okay.
That is correct.
Okay, we're in
Sorry for the
business.
confusion. Go ahead, Rod.
Okay, those of you with some expertise, kindly unmute and jump in, because I'm an old industrial sales guy. This isn't my territory, but I'll follow along with my outline here a little bit. And I have entitled this Epidemics in Prismatic Times. Well then, the charter members who formed the Prismatic Club first gathered in Sam Bartlett's rooms at 87 Washington, just below Larned, on December 21st, 1866. Well, I remember Cobo going up when I was a kid, but I can't say that I remember what was there before. Anyway, in those days, the painful echoes of the Civil War were still fresh, and that carnage featured far more death from disease than from bullets or cannonballs. Camp fever, that's typhus. That is not to mention typhoid, which is a different thing, dysentery, cholera, yellow fever, anthrax, you name it. The military surgeons and nurses, like the remarkably eloquent Clara Barton, kept surprisingly meticulous records, and by our first year, those notes served as a basis for a scientific look at what had happened. Among the popular ideas of 1866 was that disease was mainly spread by miasma, and that's to say by bad air. Actually, as a working theory, that's not bad. Even when I was a kid, and that was a little after 1866, and even in college, we were told to keep a window cracked at night to let the bad air out. I bet some of you guys remember that one. But the year of our founding, 1866, Louis Pasteur published his paper, Diseases in Wine. That paper attributed failures in wine fermentation to unwanted microorganisms. But Pasteur didn't stop there. He was also at work in his lab working with silkworms, and they led him to think that microorganisms made more than just wine sick. They made silkworms sick too, and no doubt people as well. Oh, earlier on, folks like smallpox vaccine man Edward Jenner probably had the general idea. But in 1866, Pasteur took that idea into the lab and showed that it was so. 1878, yellow fever made big trouble in New Orleans. There it festered in, and rather in 1866, there was an epidemic in New Orleans, but in 1878, when it really let loose and swept up the Mississippi to visit every river city and small town south of St. Louis. The lower Mississippi epidemic of 1878 involved at least 120,000 cases and 20,000 deaths. The epidemic sent the lower Mississippi fleeing, those that could afford it, for the countryside or running for up north. But understanding where yellow fever came from had to wait for another epidemic 20 years later. In 1889, okay, 1889 was a double bad year. If a pandemic is an epidemic that shows no respect for international borders, then Russian flu was sure one of those. Deadly, it killed 1 million people across the world, but it was also notable for the speed that it spread. First identified in Bukhara, Russia, in May 1889, it was in the US by fall. And we think maybe modern rail and steamship transportation had plenty to do with the speed that it spread. Some early survivors lasted into the 1960s and some into the 70s. And by then, we knew how to take a close look at their antibodies. Those tests suggest that Russian flu was viral, not bacterial. And more recent studies on exhumed bodies tells us that it was a member of virus subtype H3, a type that includes regular flu vaccines today, and is a country cousin of our present problem. 1889 was a double bad year. 1889, cries for help from Cubans who Spain was rounding up and tossing into concentration camps for extermination by starvation, plus Spain's thinking of the Maine. And oh yes, Peter, Spain did sink the Maine. That was April 1889. Of 230,000 troops we sent to fight that war, 55,000 suffered yellow fever. For every man killed in action, 13 died of yellow fever. After our quick victory over Spain, with Cubans and their militias at our side, that is, we gave Cuba plenty of help getting back on its feet. And one part of that was sending Army Captain, later Major, Major Walter Reed, to look into the yellow fever. Reed had looked at earlier work by a Cuban doctor named Carlos Finley. Finley suggested yellow fever was spread by mosquitoes, specifically the Aedes aegypti. Where's some Latin speakers to help me out with that one? But Reed was able to demonstrate that Finley was in fact correct. It was mosquitoes spreading yellow fever. Then Reed led an army effort at mosquito eradication, and it proved effective against yellow fever in Cuba. In the bargain, Reed's mosquito control ideas let us proceed where the French had given up and build the Panama Canal. (1906) typhoid. There was a typhoid outbreak in New York. And my page is missing here, so I'll wing Typhoid Mary. Typhoid Mary was a cook working in the suburbs of New York City from Ireland, and she worked at several different families and managed to spread typhoid fever. Typhoid is caused by atrocious sanitation, by a person who's a carrier, atrocious sanitation, and serving uncooked food. And Mary did all of the above. And so Mary, the cases were ultimately tracked back to Mary, and she was involuntarily isolated, where she stayed in isolation in 1938. But the episode taught us plenty about bacteria, sanitation, and proper food preparation practices. Well, gentlemen, my printer has cheated me, so I'm going to wing another one. Polio has been around a long time. Epidemics were cyclical. For example, in 1894, there was an epidemic, and again in 1914 up to 16. Ancient records lead us to believe polio goes back to classic times and before. There are records from the Greeks and even that sound a lot like polio, and even this Egyptian art looks suspiciously like polio. And Bill, I'll get back to polio when we have another epidemic 20 years down the road. Spanish flu is an interesting one. It's the deadliest one in the talk. And Bill, do you want me to review our list of casualties, or shall you jump in here? Well, Bill sent a list of...
Unmute myself, yes. Rod asked me to jump in about some of this stuff, and I've read a couple of books on the 1918 one, the Berry book on the Great Influenza, and the more recent book called Pale Rider, which just came out a few years ago. And I downloaded that and read it last week. And it goes over not just the nuts and bolts of the flu, where it started, how it grew, how many waves there were, but it also went over, talked a lot about both books, but this more recent one even more, talk about the changes in society and the changes in the world that resulted from the deaths from the people who died and the people who actually survived the Spanish flu. And I just as my contribution, one of my contributions to this talk, I made up a list for Rod of just extracted a few names of people who died during the Spanish flu. And obviously, what was it, Rod? 50 million people total died of it?
Something like that. Well, the numbers are a tough read because
Right.
records are equivocal, but an awful lot of people. In the tens of millions, certainly.
Tens of millions. So I'm just going to talk about 4 or 5 of them here. If you go to the next slide, I think Rose Cleveland was the sister of Grover Cleveland, and Grover Cleveland, when he entered the presidency, was a bachelor. So there was no first lady. So his sister took over the first lady duties for a couple of years until he got married after his second year in office, and she moved back to Kansas, I think it was. But she was one of the victims of the Spanish flu in 1918. The next one is, this is, I think, is really interesting, and actually I might do a prismatic talk on this. Yaki Sverdlov died of the flu, probably, although historians, there are other opinions of different historians. Sverdlov was a major player in the formation of the Soviet Union. He was a big supporter of Lenin. He was one of Lenin's kind of right-hand men. He was one of the organizers of the Bolshevik Revolution, and he's one of the ones responsible for sending the word out through Russia that the Tsar had been defeated, or that the Bolsheviks had taken over. And people said that Lenin was the thinker, but Sverdlov was the one who implemented Lenin's thoughts on how to proceed for Russia. And he was the one who was supposedly responsible for the execution of Tsar Nicholas and the execution and the rest of the Romanov family. And he died in the flu in he was actually the first de facto president of the Soviet Union, even though the Soviet Union itself was not established for a few more years. But he basically was running the country until he died in 1918. And he and Stalin apparently didn't really like each other. But when Lenin died in the early 20s, what was it, about 22, 24, Lenin died? Certainly Sverdlov would have been in line to take over the Soviet Union at that time had he been around. And it would have been interesting to know whether Sverdlov would have assassinated Stalin or Stalin would have assassinated Sverdlov to see who was actually going to take over the Soviet Union. But that choice was not made because Sverdlov died in 1918. Next slide. Bill Yaki was the owner of the Detroit Tigers from 1903 to 1919, even though he didn't really like the baseball team that much. He didn't pay a lot of attention to it. So in 1908, he sold half his interest to Frank Navin. So he was a 50% owner of the Tigers from 1908 to 1919 when he died of the flu. And interestingly enough, his adopted son, what was the other Yaki's name? The other Yaki who actually ended up owning the Boston Red Sox for 44 years was the adopted son of Bill Yaki. So both the Yakis, the Tigers owner and the Red Sox owner, were both born in Detroit. And next slide. The Dodge brothers, this is interesting to me because they didn't really die in a time frame that I thought would put them as victims of the flu. But in reading about it, the Spanish flu had 3 waves, and the third wave was February of 1919, which is pretty much gone by the summer of 1919, but enough of it lingered on, so there were cases through 1919. And the Dodge brothers attended the auto show in New York in 1919, and they both caught the flu. And Horace never really recovered from, both caught the flu and pneumonia. Horace never really recovered and died in 1920. John didn't recover either. He went back and forth. He was healthy. He went into and out of sickness for about a year. He was obviously very upset over his brother's death, and he moved to Florida. And they were both, especially John, were terrible alcoholics. So he drank his way through 1920 and ultimately died of cirrhosis in 1920. And there are a bunch of other people who died. The mother of William Randolph Hearst died. The son of Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes guy, he died, and Doyle never wrote another work of fiction. So there's a long list of people who died as a result of the Spanish flu. And I think that's the last one. Oh, here are the noticeable survivors. I'll go really quickly. Dashiell Hammett, the novelist who wrote The Thin Man and the Maltese Falcon. Walt Disney was going to be set in the combat in World War I when he caught the flu, put in the hospital. By the time he recovered, the war was over. Alfonso of Spain caught the flu, and he's the one the Spanish flu is named after. Raymond Chandler, detective novelist. Lillian Gish, actress. Haile Selassie, Emperor of Ethiopia. Gandhi caught the flu. David Lloyd George, British Prime Minister, caught the flu. Franz Kafka, who was not a very healthy guy anyway, he caught the flu and recovered. George O'Keeffe, Black Jack Pershing, American general, caught it. Mary Pickford, actress. Franklin Roosevelt was Secretary of the Navy, and he caught the flu. Leo Szilard, famous nuclear physicist. Kaiser Wilhelm, the last German emperor, caught the flu. And importantly, Woodrow Wilson, US president at the end of World War I, caught the flu. And there are people who say that the flu incapacitated him to such an extent that in the Treaty of Paris, he was not able to object strongly enough to the sanctions put on Germany by the French that ultimately contributed to the rise of Hitler and ultimately World War II. And I think that's I mean, there's a huge list, but these are the ones I put down.
Don't go away, Bill. I'm going to call you back in a second. Spanish flu had some curious aspects to it. One, as Bill mentioned, is it seemed to come in waves. A lot of epidemics come in waves. There's a terrific epidemic, and then it goes quiet for a while, and then back it comes and quiet for a while. What I think is curious is one of the charts here shows city by city across America. For example, Baltimore, Augusta, and San Francisco, the waves came in step with one another. I think that's really curious, and it'd be, how does that happen? But there it is.
Perhaps Greg Auner can contribute something here.
Yeah, I have a few comments on that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right. It's interesting, firstly, why it's called the Spanish flu. Does anybody know that? Because it didn't originate in Spain at all.
Right.
It could be France, it could have been other places, but more likely United States and Kansas. The reason why it's called the Spanish flu is because it became a little bit political, and people downplay the amount of the plague for various geopolitical reasons in their countries. And Spain actually had the most accurate and thorough accounting of that. And because they showed a very large number of fatalities early on. So it became the Spanish flu, even though it did not originate there. So the Spanish flu is one of the H1N1 avian-like flus, an RNA virus type of flu that killed probably about 40 million people. And to put it in perspective, about 25 to 30% of the world's population result in the catching the flu and then ultimately dying. It was a very devastating one for various reasons. The second comment is this double hump that you're showing. One of the problems with RNA viruses, in general influenza viruses, is their high mutation rate. So they mutate because of host changes. So like the Black Plague in the past, where it was hosted in rats and later in people, they mutated due to those host environments and became more virulent. It started out being something that wasn't virulent at all and became very virulent. Likewise, influenza, the reason you need to have a different vaccine every year is because it mutates so quickly. Later on, I'll comment on the Sars virus that we're talking about today and how that may differ. But influenza is very problematic because of that mutation rate. And that's the very reason why you see those double humps, because it's a host response change in mutation that occurs. So it's a little bit of different virus that you recatch later on.
And Greg, I even read in this more recent book the people who were infected in the first and second waves of 1918 were not necessarily immune from the virus that was around for the third wave.
Excellent point. Because of that mutation, you don't have host immunity. The host immunity lasts weeks to months, a few months in influenza's case. It's quite different, hopefully, in the coronavirus class, where it can last for years, but I'll comment on that later on.
Okay.
Another curiosity is the age of the victims. The Spanish flu did its worst work on people in the prime of life on this chart, age 25 to 45. And there is some thought that maybe the earlier Russian flu had provided at least some level of immunity to older people. But there is another theory here that seems to have come forward more recently, and maybe Bill or Greg can help me out here. And that is that what was really taking the Spanish flu victims out was a cytokine storm. In other words, your body reacting, an overreaction of the immune system, and that overreaction itself takes itself out. Can you comment on that, Bill or Greg?
Greg, you want to take that?
Yeah.
Sure. That is one problem. So in the current epidemic or pandemic, cytokine storm is quite prevalent in high risk individuals, and there's a trace back to the physiology of why that happens. Interestingly, if you're younger, particularly if you're very young, and you're exposed on an average of 8 times per year in your grade school to corona-like viruses, you do not have these cytokine storms. And for all practical purposes, statistically, you're immune. The few reported deaths really had nothing to do with this virus. It had to do with encephalitis and other primary diseases. And that's a problem, actually, even today with counting a coronavirus, quote, coronavirus or Sars virus death as a death by that, when actually it's other things that occur. The other thing is the superbugs, antimicrobial resistant bacteria, seems to be the main culprit that's occurring as a secondary infection to intubated patients. That is really becoming a strong culprit in that 25% of the cases have MRSA or VRSA, which is vancomycin resistant bacteria, which is what killing them when they're intubated. It looks like the majority are going to end up, it's a bacterial infection. And that's not uncommon either for people who are chronically on a ventilator. That is a very common problem, and usually the ultimate cause of death, not because of the virus or even the cytokine storm. The cause of the pneumonia, though, is the cytokine storm. And what occurs is a movement of fluid into the lungs from the blood vessels to help this immune system, T cells, other types of things that inflammatory or markers to bring things in to get rid of the infection. The problem is it's too high. And when it's too high, you have a lot of fluid that goes into the lungs and other reactions and inflammatory responses that actually cause damage. So it's really a host response that is really the culprit that occurs with this virus, particularly if you have very high risk issues. Diabetes, because of how it affects the blood vessels. If you have congenital heart disease, things like that, those risks are really exacerbated by this type of disease. This is not the only kind of disease that does that. Influenza, on the other hand, strikes the young very, very hard. So while there were 0 deaths from in the current Sars virus in children, that week that they started to break out, there were 14 children that died from influenza. And I don't know if you want to right now to know some of the statistical differences between influenza and the SARS virus, or maybe later on I can talk about that. But it's kind of interesting and enlightening and maybe surprising based on some of the news events that you're hearing now.
Shall we just hold that for the end, and as we'll work through the rest of it and get back and come back to COVID-19?
Yes.
Diphtheria, 1921. And I rolled that in with scarlet fever, which was World War II era, peaking in 42. Both of those are somewhat similar in that they coat the tongue, the back of your throat, make breathing difficult, and are dangerous. And in both cases, widespread quarantines were applied to any house with a victim from diphtheria or scarlet fever. We had a diphtheria vaccine in 1926, but as far as I know, we do not yet have a scarlet fever vaccine. Measles, I'm not putting a date on this one because it tends to come in rapid cycles. Every 2 years, it seems, when I was a kid, we get whacked. Measles, German measles, rubella, they're not the same thing, but I'm rolling them together here. And both are really dangerous. For example, in the early 19th century, they virtually knocked out the native population in Hawaii. We got a handle on measles with a vaccine in 1954, and then through a complicated and varied road that only Bill Brussilow could guide us through, improvements in that vaccine made it applicable to rubella in 1969. And in areas where we do a good job of vaccinating, well, we're doing all right. But the disease is far from under control, especially in the third world. It's still rampant and it's still dangerous. Our estimable president, Bill Brussilow, gave a terrific talk on polio. But I think it is interesting that polio came raging back after World War II worse than ever. And one of the theories there is that it was actually improvements in sanitation, in that we hadn't been exposed to so much stuff in youth. And so when polio came along, we weren't as tough as we used to be. To the best of my knowledge, nobody suggested that we return to open sewers in order to fight polio. But having said that, perhaps, Bill, you could do a recount.
To summarize my talk in like a minute, polio has been in the human population forever and ever and ever, but there were really no outbreaks until the late 1800s, as people understood the germ theory of disease, and that if you Pasteur and Koch and other people showed that diseases were caused by bacteria or by germs, so people started washing their hands and cleaning the surfaces in their home. And when children were born, they were no longer just covered with shit all day. But polio is before the move to cleanliness and sanitation, essentially everyone got exposed to polio right away when they were born. Because polio you get polio by ingesting poop that has the polio virus in it. And before things were clean, kids were covered with poop all the time. So everyone was inoculating themselves with polio when they were young enough to still be protected by maternal antibodies. So polio itself is not a terrible disease. It's just, it's a disease that basically 70% of the people with active polio infections never know they have it. Another 25 to 29% just feel a little off. They're a little sick for a week or two and they recover and they're fine. The actual polio, the polio cases that we think of as cases are the 1 or 2% where the virus gets out of the intestine, gets into the blood and crosses the blood-brain barrier. So the so-called polio cases are actually a very, very small minority of people who actually get infected with polio. But as society got cleaner and cleaner, fewer and fewer people, more and more people got through infancy and early life without being exposed to polio. So when it did come back, it came back as these kind of epidemics of polio, these waves of polio, these polio epidemics that showed up randomly at different times, as Rod has pointed out a couple of them. No one really knew what was going on with polio. And we still don't know. Why was it only in the summer? Why was it mainly in boys and not girls? We don't know what the answers to any of those, because by the early 50s, by 1955, 54, Salk had a vaccine, and then the Sabin vaccine came along later. But polio is interesting. It never was a pandemic. It's a disease that people have had for centuries and centuries, thousands of years. And it's just something that showed up because we got our act together in terms of cleanliness and sanitation.
1982 and 1981, oddball lung infections and rare cancers were found in the U.S. in gay men and drug users. Unbeknownst to us, probably about 300,000 people were already infected worldwide. In fact, we now think AIDS surely goes back to into the 1970s in Africa, and maybe as early as 1921 in the Congo. In September 1982, the Center for Disease Control called the underlying syndrome acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS. And in 1984, the underlying virus was finally identified, and the name human immunodeficiency syndrome, or HIV, was applied to that virus. By 1995, AIDS was the leading cause of death in the US in persons 25 to 44 years old. Drugs, especially drug cocktails, have slowed HIV's progress in its victim, but they have not cured it. Efforts to provide low-cost generic drugs to the third world, including George Bush's 2003 multi-billion-dollar program, plus low-cost drug manufacturing, especially in India, are ongoing efforts. For all that, AIDS is still unchecked, and infection rates, especially in Africa, are appalling. Okay, the 2000s, and here, Bill and Greg, maybe you can give me a lot of help. Severe acute respiratory syndrome. That's a novel coronavirus like today's crisis, and it too came from China. It is by no means under control, but so far, isolation of victims seems to have slowed its spread. 2009, swine flu. Spread like crazy in 2009. Like Spanish flu in 1918, it seems to affect older people less than those in the prime of life. Vaccines are now in trials. Middle East respiratory syndrome. Another coronavirus, but this one's not from China. No vaccine so far. Ebola, a rare but incredibly deadly African bleeding disease. It's an oddball. It traces back to 1976 near the Ebola River in the Congo. It's caused by any one of several viruses. A vaccine was approved in 2019. Zika, however you pronounce it, spread by our old friend, the mosquito, the yellow fever mosquito, or can be spread sexually. It's often unnoticed in adults, but it's extra dangerous because it causes birth defects. It's even on the loose in the southern United States now. So, gentlemen, Greg, I think you were going to comment on some of our more current stuff.
Well, actually, Rob, before Greg, can you put up that last slide that I sent you? The very last one in that presentation that I gave you.
Well, that was on victims.
Okay, no, hang on. I'll just read it. In 2016, so 2016, the National Academy of Sciences convened a commission with a jaw-breaking name, the Commission on Creating a Global Health Risk Framework for the Future. So in 2016, they put out a report, And their report estimated there was a 20% chance of 4 global pandemics in the following 100 years. So here we are 4 years later, and we're in the first one of those. Okay, Greg?
Yeah, I may have misplaced that slide.
That's fine.
Greg, were you going to add something?
Yeah, just a couple of things to think about. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates that around 39 to 56 million people get the flu, influenza, every year. And that results in between 24 to 62,000 deaths every year. And we're up around there. If you counted the deaths as we do in this particular pandemic, where auxiliary things that kill you are also counted as for this virus, that number would be probably double that, in the 100, maybe 120,000. So there's some interesting ways that things are counted or not counted. So I think that's quite interesting. Second thing is, I mentioned that's highly mutated events in influenza, which is why we have to have a new vaccine every time or every year, and it varies each time. Its immunity lasts maybe several months, maybe just several weeks. There are cases that are recorded where you have had the flu and then a month later you can catch it again, but although that's rare, and it's usually in people who are more stressed immunologically. Coronaviruses, or the common cold type virus, or SARS viruses, SARS-1, which came out of China in the same location from a ill researcher who died, and then it spread around China, basically in the same place. That first came out, was contained very, very rapidly. Most people who were exposed to it did not have symptoms in there. Again, it followed the pattern of people who were older and vulnerable and had secondary, let's say, pathologies, were exposed to it and had cytokine storm issues and pneumonia that occurred. That particular virus showed immunity for 1 to 2 years, which would be good news if this SARS-CoV-2 virus that we're currently have a pandemic follows the same suit as that SARS virus, which would mean if you were exposed, you would have about 1 to 2 year immunity as compared to influenza, which is much more highly mutating. I'll make 2 comments in there. I'm actually much more worried about influenza. Influenza, another bird flu, which is the N9 flu, is so foreign to our immune system that it is extremely dangerous. And there's a lot of work being done by the US government now in preparation, testing, treatments and vaccines for that one, because its potential is much worse than what we're seeing right now. The second thing that I would say about this is, it's an interesting virus from the standpoint, it's a typical SARS virus. It has an outside protein appendages that bind onto your cells. It then injects in RNA, which then replicates its virus within your cell, then bursts out. From that standpoint, it can replicate very, very quickly. This is different from the standpoint of say a very virulent disease that kills very, very quickly. This is one that is pretty benign in almost everybody, but is highly, highly contagious and doesn't burn out like the current, like very, very deadly diseases that cause death within days. They burn out in a region. People don't travel very far, so those epidemics usually stay epidemics, don't become pandemics. On the other hand, SARS is highly contagious, which may be good news for one reason. So right now, the estimates are that this may be a R0 number of 8. And what that means is influenza is normally a 1 to 2. That means for every 1 person or 2 people, you will spread this disease to 1 other person or 2 other people. And then they will spread it to 1 to 2 other people. So it's a geometric progression. This one looks like it's heading to an R5 or even an R8, which means every one person spreads it to 8 people. If that's true, then it's following some of the data that we see in Sweden and some of the data that we're seeing in prisons, where 50% of the population show that they're, after testing, that they're exposed, but only about 100 people out of 4,000 in these prisons, in one example, actually show any symptoms whatsoever. So you may think it's really bad if it's if the R number is very high and it spread a lot more than we think it did, but actually that may be good news from the standpoint of its fatality. If that is true, and the early numbers coming out of New York and these prison studies and other studies are true, and it's an R8, that would mean the fatality rate is more like 0.02 to 0.01, which is right in line with influenza, which is a lot better than what they started out thinking, that it was a fatality rate of somewhere around 3 to even 5%, which would be horrendous given a population of 350 million people.
That was the 1918, right? Around 5%, 3%,
Yeah,
5%.
it was. That was so that was exactly what I was talking about with the N9 influenza. That particular, also bird flu, avian flu, was very, very different from the standpoint of our immune system. And that's the problem. If we have an immune system, if we have something that's like it, and we activate our T cells and we've revved up our immune system, we're much less likely to get very ill and have high fatality rates. But when it's something totally foreign, that's when we have problems in there. When there were first settlers coming over to the United States, they brought influenza that was totally foreign to the native population, and it devastated the population. I mean, it would cause massive casualties, which then they thought were poisoning of them, and there's retaliation and all these things that happen. You know, these diseases have caused all kinds of interesting and devastating political outcomes as well. But what I worry about more is influenza, because its mutation rate. And the Sars virus, as bad as this is probably not quite what the media is putting out there right now. I think there's a lot of evidence. I work with the hospital systems. I work now with the Department of Defense and National Institute of Health on this particular problem in detection, as well as immunoassays, you know, with our system that we're doing. And I think there's a lot of overcounting of the deaths caused by the virus as opposed to other things like superbacteria infections versus vancomycin resistant staph infections, MRSA, and others, which are causing the ultimate problems in, you know, people who are on ventilators, as well as the other things, other causes that are chalked up to this because there's economic reasons as well. If you get full reimbursement if you die from this, from the US government. But if you have other types of diseases that might have caused it, but you've also show positive for this, are you going to you know, show that it's caused by this virus and get full reimbursement, or not do that? And there's actually a lot of controversy over that right now, and a lot of pressure economically to overcount in some ways the fatalities due to the virus versus the fatalities due to other types of secondary things. I think what will fall out from this, and the Swedish experiment is quite fascinating in how they've approached it and the outcomes they're having. Just to kind of summarize what seems to be coming out of that, they were doing everything wrong, right? They had social distancing, they said. They said that we will not close down restaurants, we will not close down cafes, we will keep businesses open as usual, we will have good practices, washing hands, we will try to keep distances, and we will do very, very high protection for the vulnerable, more elderly population, et cetera. And they did have spikes, but they, if you look over the overall numbers, they had around 1,000 deaths out of 2,000 in the hospital and 10 million population. That's going around 0.01%. And it's actually substantially lower than the rest of Europe, except for some countries surrounding there that have very sparse population, like Norway. So their theory, which appears to be panning out, is that herd immunity was the best way of doing that. And that's how we get over the flu. We get over the flu in two ways. One is herd immunity. People are exposed to it, and we have this gap of weeks to months where we have immunity and we don't recatch it. And now if I have the flu and I'm going to give it to Bill, but Bill already has immunity, he stopped it. He cannot give it out to another person. And that's the theory that Sweden did, and it seemed to work in the numbers. Earlier on, there were a lot of information about spikes there, but if you look at the numbers over the long period, it kind of worked. In fact, it did work. So that's how we get over things. The controversy now in the health community is by lowering the curve, which everybody agrees you want to lower the problems in the hospital systems, but you're also spreading it out. And you may have a case where, because of the summer months, you decrease the likelihood of spread of this because swelling of the virus, of humidity and other things that help stop viruses, as well as gradual buildup of herd immunity. People who have had it didn't know they had it, but they're immune to it now, which may be mitigating a lot of this. But for a lot of other cases, you're just spreading out the time, and they'll still get exposed to it later, because if this is a R8 and you don't have immunity, you will get exposed to it most likely. And it'll just be in a longer period later, and you may not know it. So that's kind of the sketchy information that's coming out. It's not widely known, but it is in circles that are studying it very carefully now. Coming out is a little bit of a different story of how things are treated, how Sweden treated it versus how we're treating it and other countries are treating it. Information that's correct, information that's not correct, how many actually die from this virus versus dying from secondary complications or even primary complications that are counted toward this. So the numbers are very sketchy. And certainly the numbers out of China are just not to be believed at all. I mean, they're most likely completely wrong. So we don't really have an accurate number of how many people have it, other than these studies in the prison system, studies in Sweden, and a few others where we're getting some of that information now, which is telling a little bit of a different story. So the good news may be that it's highly contagious, but not as virulent for general population, but very, very problematic for people who may have high risk, in which case there's got to be a lot of precautions. The second thing is we may or may not be helping ourselves by not, having herd immunity, early on and just extending this out longer. That's just unknown at this point. The third thing is that the virus itself is hopefully like the other SARS virus and does induce an immunity for a number of 1 to 2 years, which would be very good news. One bad thing I will say, though, is that there are 3 strains now. There's a strain that came in directly from China to California. There is a strain that passed through Europe and mutated a little bit slightly to the East Coast, which hit particularly New York. And there's another mutation that has hit India. India is not as bad because of the weather and other factors, but on the other hand, the sanitary problems have exacerbated it quite a bit. Having said that, the mutation seems to be pretty slight, so that may not have an effect on a vaccine effectiveness and that type of thing. So it's a mixed bag. It's a lot unknown, and there's a lot of information I think that's been around that's probably not accurate, both on how virulent it is and how contagious it is, et cetera. And whether we're going to be having this in a cyclic event or not.
Can I step in for a minute?
Sure.
I have for the last 4 weeks, well, actually 5 weeks, been privileged to work with Ananda Prasad, who is the distinguished professor of oncology and immunology at Wayne State Medical School. He has done a number of in vitro studies, starting back with the introduction of the Sars virus back in the early 2000s, I mean. And he believes, as many of you may know, he's sort of a guru in zinc. He is convinced that zinc is the means by which to control this virus. That zinc will go into the infected human host, change the RNA that has already been infected, and prevent replication. And he has a series of studies that he has done for the last 20 years, almost, not quite, 15 years, with in vitro studies that show this is the case. If you're interested in looking at that scientific concept, you can personally go to MedCram, MEDCRAM, medcram.com. That's a physician's information network. Look up report number 34. And in the last 15 minutes of that 17-minute video, you will see the, and it's backed by, again, in vitro. Human studies have not been done. They are about to be done, by the way. I'll just tell you about that in a minute. But the in vitro studies indicate how the zinc affects the virus. They also have discovered, and this was not Ananda's doing, these were the Koreans who discovered it. Despite what you're hearing about hydroxychloroquine and all the screaming and yelling about it, hydroxychloroquine is the most effective ionophore for putting zinc into the cell, the infected cell. And therefore, a cocktail between about 200 milligrams of hydroxychloroquine with 100 milligrams of zinc should, and I'll give you something in a minute, prevent the virus, and you should do it early. You don't wait till the virus gets to critical points where other issues come in, and you might need azithromycin or something. But at the earliest elements that you are aware that you might have the virus, 200 milligrams a day of hydroxychloroquine with 100 milligrams of zinc for a regimen of 5 to 10 days should work. Interestingly, Ananda, who's 92 years old and has a number of problems that make him highly risky, did contract the coronavirus, as did his wife, Arabella, who's also 92. And he treated them, himself and his wife, with that treatment. And he has survived, not just survived, he's completely cured of the virus and is back fully working. It took about 2 weeks. But the DMC and Ford Hospital System, starting I think Monday or Tuesday, is going to do a full trial with, you can't do random. You got to have people who have just tested for the virus at the early stages, but they're going to do a placebo-based process with 3,000 subjects using hydroxychloroquine with zinc and hydroxychloroquine with a placebo for the next 3 weeks. And we should have the results at the end of the month as to this study. So I'll just bring that into the equation.
Yeah, I think that follows the French study. There was a very large French study which then caused use of that in Europe, where so zinc has been well known as blocking the RNA virus type of replication in there if you can get that in the cell. And what the drug does is basically, it's lack of a better word, poke holes in the cell.
Yes.
Really holes. It allows transport. That's a more accurate term, of zinc into the cell. And the French studies on early onset are very, very promising. Those were blinded studies. And then Britain followed suit, and a number of European countries did too.
Greg, could I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why is zinc being ignored within the framework of at least the media conversation of all this?
Well, I don't know. It's been long known to be antiviral if you can get it in the cell. One of the problems has always been that just taking zinc alone doesn't necessarily mean that it gets transported into the cell and can effectively block the virus, replication. Whereas the malaria drug is one of a class of drugs that does open transport, and that may be why that works in those cases. The French study showed early onset, it worked very effectively. Late onset, probably not, and it's probably because at that point, something else is a problem, like a bacterial infection that's occurring that's killing people. And that's certainly coming out more and more that's a culprit later on. I don't know, but for a long time, zinc has been known to be an anti-RNA virus replicant if you can get it in there. But just taking it alone doesn't seem to work like that. There's some evidence in coronaviruses and colds that in the mucous membrane portions that there's some effectiveness of zinc. But that's always been inconclusive. But I think in vitro studies, and I've seen those in the French studies in particular, they're showing some good evidence, and they are blinded studies. My guess is that people take zinc just to take zinc and think it'll block that, and that's probably not effective on its own. There's no mechanism for it to get into a cell.
Yeah, it's whatever ionophore you might have in your body, if there is any.
Greg and Bill, I have a question. The Spanish flu, after 3 iterations, seemed to burn itself out. Was that simply because herd immunity achieved a high enough level so that it could not transmit, or was there something else going on? And how does the answer to that question possibly relate to how the Corona-19 might fade out? And then a question for you, Greg, is there any hope at all that advanced technology can create a rapid way of testing with high reliability for these viruses?
So from my standpoint, the early flus, the H1N1s, probably were herd immunity, and then it mutated out to a less virulent form. But herd immunity is the main blocking way of stopping these kind of pandemics or spreading of diseases of this type until they change enough. Just like they mutate to jump from a bird or from a swine to human, they can jump later on and mutate later as well. It's a very dynamic virus, influenza, so it is very highly mutated capacity. And RNA viruses in general are, but particularly influenza type of viruses. So that's probably what happened, was herd immunity and a mutation, a high mutation rate. It mutated out of being able to bind in human.
That's my impression from what I read as well, that it had herd immunity and the virus mutated.
So how does that affect the annual cycle of getting a flu shot? Will that all be incorporated in it, or is the mutation rate too rapid for that to be effective?
Well, that's one of the problems. They come out of Asia typically, and by the time that they're isolated and analyze exactly the particular strain that they are, they almost have to guess, because the time it takes to do a vaccine is pretty long, and to ramp up to millions of doses. So it's kind of a guesstimate, and they guesstimate wrong frequently. But any of those vaccines, even if they're wrong, they do ramp up T cell activation, and they do have some effectiveness. It just depends how effective they are.
If you look at,
90% or are they 10%?
if you look at the CDC website, they have a big table on the flu going back decades, and they can tell you how effective the vaccines were in each year. And it's really not very good. I mean,
yeah, it's all over the map.
You rarely see anything over 50%, and there was one just a year or two ago that was only like 25% effective.
Yeah.
So they're just guessing.
Still, 25 to 50% helps, and there's unknown factors of the revving up the immune system that a lot of clinicians think do help in some way to shorten the flu, even if you have it. So it's I think advisable to have the vaccine.
Absolutely.
But it's not something that you're going to have a vaccine necessarily. That means that you're immune, period.
Greg, based on your comments earlier, where we've seemed to have somewhat flattened the curve, would it not be based on just science? Let's get out of the political realm. Let's get out of all the economic. Let's just forget all that. Just from a sheer scientific point of view, would it not be worthwhile at this point to possibly go to the herd process for the future?
Well, I think that we will see very soon, when they complete the grand study of 10 million people in Sweden, which have city densities similar to they are in the rest of Europe and the United States, clusters in cities, and then more rural areas. And that's a good model. So far, they have lower than Britain, lower than France, lower than Spain, lower than most of Europe. Norway, where they're very spread out, is the only one I think that has a fatality rate that's lower than Sweden does. But Sweden took the herd immunity standpoint, and I think in about a month or two, we'll really know how that compared to what the rest of Europe and the United States are doing. There are two theories I thought, and neither one is wrong. They're different. So the one is that you flatten that curve because you don't want to overwhelm the medical system, and that's sensible. In addition to that, you're spreading out the time so that you have other treatments that may occur, and you're going into the summer months, which would lower, in theory, the spread if it's like other SARS viruses or cold viruses, because of the swelling of it, the humidity, the lack of transport in the air, the more UV, more people outside, fresh air. I don't understand closing parks. It's the worst thing you can do. We should be getting out there in the parks. So that's the one theory. The other theory, and the Swedish theory, is that, look, like influenza, you get here, you start to have a lot of people affected. Vast majority of them won't even know they've, been exposed to it. Some people will get sick and get over it, but they'll be immune to it, and they'll be blockers. They will stop the spread when they're exposed to it. It goes no further. So that geometric spread now starts to decrease and decrease and decrease. So now you've kind of blocked it out of society, and then you can let the more, let's say, susceptible people out, because it's now gone down to nothing. And it's done so rapidly. And that's that triangular shape, theory, where you're going up rapidly and then down rapidly. The advantage of that, obviously, is that's the classical way that we get over these, and then things are seasonal. The problem with, potential problem with that is twofold. One is if it overwhelms the medical community, so that you can't adequately take care of people. And the second problem is that you don't have that delay where you may find other alternative treatments that may occur. Which one ends up better? It'll be interesting to see in the next couple of months, because those studies out of Sweden and the studies out of here, and how we'll have a double hump, we will. We're just delaying the number of people who are exposed by doing what we're doing right now. On the other hand, we don't overwhelm the hospital systems, and we've come up with some more antiviral treatments in the meantime. But
Greg?
In the long run, who knows?
Greg,
And I think that, I think
if
that's the key to the Swedish thing, because I've been following those numbers too. As Greg says, we'll have a much better idea in a few months, because Sweden has been willing to have more, in terms of absolute numbers, more deaths now. But by the end of the summer, it may be far fewer deaths, and they've had their economy open the whole time. So that's what we'll have to wait and see.
And if you look at the numbers now compared, though, they early on they did, but now they're average lower overall. So,
Greg?
Yes.
If the summer-winter dichotomy is an important factor, why wouldn't states like Florida and Louisiana have completely different profiles than Massachusetts and Michigan? And
They may. The problem is other factors. So, for example, in Louisiana, you have this huge crowd gathered together, so you have this huge spike. But what may happen is a lowering that spike very, very rapidly, in which case that would lend itself to be the weather does affect it. We know UV helps kill it. There's already NIH study on UVB, UVC, and how quickly it will kill that. We know that swelling of it decreases that. We know that people getting out as well increase it. And quite frankly, you get out and get more vitamin D, your immune system is revved up. So that helps as well. Florida is the exact same thing. You have a large number of people gathering, so you get this spike, but overall, they seem to be lowering very, very quickly, which would indicate a decrease. Now, along those lines, you're seeing an uptick as the other side of the equator starts to go into their fall and winter season. You're starting to see in Brazil these upticks that are going, and that's a classic seasonal swing that occurs. More gray days, longer days, more rain, and more people staying indoors, less UV light, and all of those things. We'll see, but if it follows like the classic coronaviruses, there will be seasonal swings.
Greg, I know that you've worked on advanced technology of super mini processors and laser systems and a whole plethora of other technologies merging together to be able to detect very small quantities of all kinds of things. Is there, in your opinion, is there any hope that there could be an inexpensive and fast technology to improve on-site testing?
So that's controversial too. So why are we testing? Let's say you're tested on Monday and you have no virus load that they can detect. And then you go to grocery shopping on Thursday and you get exposed. To me, an immune test is much better, from the standpoint of, you've already have antibody built up, activated T cells that are going to rev into work to prevent you from going on. To me, that's a most important type of testing. Acute testing, there's a lot of hype on this is 5 minutes to 14 minutes. It's not. I mean, it's a stage 1 test. It's basically it's like a PCR test using a fluorescent tag. They take and lyse the virus open. They replicate a portion of the RNA. They tag it with a fluorescent, and then they measure that, and it's supposed to take 5 to 10 minutes. But its sensitivity and specificity ends up being about a 50% accuracy. So it's not, it's I guess better than nothing, but it's not like the tests where you send it out and you have true PCR tests.
How can you do a PCR in 5 minutes?
Pardon?
How can you do a PCR in 5 minutes?
Yeah, right. Well, then they counter and they say, well, it's really 14 or 15 minutes. I'll tell you what they're really doing. They have a replicator, right? They're just going through heating and cooling, and replicating. They're doing RNA to cDNA, and then they tag it. And then they put it in another machine to read it. So it's all, to me, a little bit voodoo. So they come up with, in the study so far, 50% accuracy, meaning true positive, true negatives. That's a flip of the coin. And to me, that's not a good test at all. And you're right, you can't get something that fast. And I guess it's something that's better than nothing, maybe, or maybe not. I don't know. I wouldn't rely on it.
In support of that, the my mother-in-law, my ex-mother-in-law, I guess we still talk, has spent the last couple of weeks in the hospital over what really amounts to a urinary tract infection, having nothing to do with this. But during the course of that stage, she's had 5 coronavirus tests, 2 of which were positive and 3 are negative. So, take your pick.
Beaumont Hospital is actually doing a pretty interesting study of the healthcare workers there, where they're doing pretty rigorous studies at PCR studies that are not rapid testing. I think it's actually a pretty good study. It's a double-blinded study where they're going to look at the exposure rate versus how many got ill. And I think that's going to be at least a microcosm of just how virulent this is in the general population. We know it's very bad for whatever reason in certain segments of the population. We know it's pretty much immune in younger people, particularly very young people, probably because they're exposed to corona-like viruses several times a year. And they're really revved up to be able to handle that. So whatever reason, it's a segmented issue that goes there. But I think that's an interesting study that's going to be coming out.
So gentlemen, we've been going for almost 2 hours. Can we have just maybe one more question and then wrap it up? That's okay. Anybody have a question?
Well, if I follow the conversation from the experts, I think I'm hearing we ought to all be meeting at the clubhouse and drinking lots of gin and tonic and chewing galvanized nails whenever we can. Is that the summary?
Negative. Next week, Ben
I have no
Gravel
idea
will be up.
what taking my G&T would taste like, to tell you the truth.
Next
I've
week,
got
Ben
one
Gravel is
question
up,
for you,
and
Bill.
the following week, Rob Sharrow's up. So
Who has a question?
I got one question. We went through all these diseases and so on, but one we left out was tuberculosis.
Oh, yeah. So
I mean, we actually established a huge hospital in Detroit just to treat tubercular patients.
it's worse than that. Out of South America, there's a highly resistant form that's coming through, and I really worry about that. Airborne, airborne pulmonary diseases are obviously the worst that you have, and that particular one is very, very resistant. So far, it's very limited here, but it is spreading through South America right now. So that was a really good point.
You have to deal with all this crap.
Yeah.
Yeah, my excuse, but the original talk was a series of epidemics that had passed through, and tuberculosis. I couldn't identify a datable epidemic. Anyway, Bill, shall we get out of here?
Bill, you're
good
muted,
job,
Bill.
everybody.
Sorry, thanks, Rod. Yeah, let's wrap it up. But Dave, you were finishing up by saying something about next week.
Well, Ben Gravel is up next week, and he's talking about something about gauge. I think it has to do something with railroad, small dimensions. And then Rob Sharrow will follow up the following week, and then that will conclude our present season. Our thinking right now, or my thinking right now, is that in the fall, we'll get started earlier than we usually do, and we'll fold in as quickly as possible those people who are unable to participate because of the present situation. And I think we'll be able to hopefully do it at the house, which is what we ought to be doing. So thank you everybody very much for participating. We've had a good turnout tonight. We had a great turnout last week. Who'd have imagined?
Dave,
Thanks,
Thank you,
Dave.
Greg,
Thank
and
you,
thank
Rod.
you, Bill.
Thank you, Rod.
Thank you, Greg.
David.
Good night.
Thank
you,
Rob.
and Bill,
Thank you, Bill.
I just
Greg.
want to
Good night. Good to see you guys.
Dave.
Yes.
Dave, you have to spell it Gauge, please.
I just copied your text.
Uh-oh, so I spell it wrong. I apologize.
I just copied. I don't accept that. But we'll make it beautiful.
Just one comment. I really like Rod Key's elegant fireplace in the background.
It's a good app.
You don't like my deck out the back?
It's only a problem when they throw new logs in.
He's got snow on the deck.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks again, Rod, Greg.